Damian Blackwood was not a man who believed in luck or fate. He knew the price of success was steep, but he was willing to pay it. From the moment he started his first business at 22, he had been relentlessly driven. His mind worked like a machine, analyzing every move, every market trend, every opportunity. His empire grew steadily, first in real estate, then in tech, and eventually into a massive multi-industry conglomerate. He built his fortune not by playing it safe, but by taking calculated risks, by ruthlessly pushing his competitors aside, and by making bold decisions others were too afraid to make. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a self-made billionaire who had earned every dollar through grit and cunning. Yet, for all his success, his greatest source of pride wasn't his sprawling penthouse in the city's skyline or the mansions in the countryside. It was his son, Elliot. Damian had envisioned him as the heir to his legacy from the day Elliot was born. He had poured every resource he could into Elliot's education, grooming him not only to take over his empire, but to become the man he had always wanted to be, a leader with integrity, ambition, and strength of character. But as Elliot grew older, Damian's dream began to unravel. At first, it was subtle. Elliot began to take his privileges for granted. Where Damian had been driven by necessity, Elliot seemed to take success as a birthright, an entitlement rather than something to earn. By his mid-20s, Elliot had begun to distance himself from the work ethic that his father had instilled in him. Instead of following Damian's example of early mornings, long hours, and sacrifices, Elliot spent his time at the most exclusive parties, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants. He was living in a world of luxury, unconcerned by the struggles of ordinary people. His arrogant attitude grew, along with his sense of superiority. Damian watched it all unfold with a growing sense of dread. His son, the young man he had raised, had become someone he hardly recognized. The boy who once asked questions about the world, about how to build a business, about the nature of success, was now dismissing those same questions in favor of self-indulgence. It broke Damian's heart. He had spent years building an empire, but as his son became more entitled, more detached from the values he held dear, Damian began to question whether he had done the right thing. Had his wealth corrupted Elliot? Had he given him too much? Was the boy still capable of understanding the true meaning of hard work and sacrifice, or was he destined to squander it all? One evening, after another particularly frustrating conversation with Elliot, Damian found himself sitting alone in his study, staring out at the city lights. The empire he had built, the life he had carved out of nothing, seemed meaningless in that moment. All the money in the world could not fill the emptiness he felt. His greatest achievement, his son, was slipping through his fingers. And then, in that moment of silence, an idea struck Damian like a bolt of lightning. Perhaps the only way to save Elliot was to force him to confront the consequences of his own choices. He couldn't sit by and watch his son destroy everything he had worked for. But what could he do? He realized then that the only way to test Elliot's character was to disappear, without telling anyone, without leaving a trace. Damian decided to vanish. He would leave behind his fortune, his family home, his high society friends, and the cushioned life Elliot had come to expect. Damian was going to live as an ordinary man, far away from the comforts of wealth and privilege. He would become a stranger in the world, and in doing so, he would see if his son cared enough to look for him. Would Elliot be able to see past the wealth and the privilege, past the veneer of success, and recognize the value of the man who had raised him? Packing a small bag with only the essentials, Damian made his way to the garage and drove off into the night. He didn't know what awaited him, but he was certain of one thing: he had to do this. It was the only way. For the first time in his life, Damian was afraid, but it was a necessary fear. He had to disappear completely. No phone calls, no messages, no clues. He was going to live as the everyman, the one who had no power or influence, a man who was nothing. He didn't care how long it would take, or if Elliot would even care. This would be his test, and he had to see it through. For weeks, Damian wandered through the streets of the city, blending in with the countless faceless individuals who lived on the margins. He had exchanged his expensive suits for second-hand clothing, and his polished shoes for worn boots. He had no ID, no connections, and no safety net. He was living the life of the poor, the overlooked, the ones society preferred to forget. The first few days were difficult. Damien had always been in control of his circumstances, but now he was at the mercy of the world. He had to rely on the kindness of strangers for food and shelter. The homeless shelters were filled with people who had their own struggles, their own stories. It was a humbling experience, one that shook him to his core. The idea of surviving on nothing but his wits felt foreign, but necessary. It was a painful reminder of how far he had distanced himself from the real world. As the days wore on, Damien began to get used to the rhythm of street life. He learned where to find food, where to sleep, and how to keep his head down. The people around him were invisible in the eyes of society, just like him now. He was no longer a billionaire. He was just another person trying to survive. But even as he adapted to this new life, Damien kept a watchful eye on Elliot. From a distance, he watched his son continue to indulge in a world of excess. Elliot still spent his days in high-end clubs, surrounded by the glitz and glamour of wealth. He dined in Michelin-starred restaurants, wearing tailored suits and driving sports cars. But there was no sign of concern. Damien hadn't heard from him. Elliot didn't seem to care. He went about his life as if nothing had changed. The emptiness Damien felt deepened. Was his son so blind, so wrapped up in his own world, that he couldn't see the absence of his father? Damien had hoped that by disappearing, he would spark something in Elliot, some sign of love, some hint of concern. But there was nothing. It was as though he had never existed. Damien's heart ached with each passing day. He had made a decision that had cost him everything. And for what? To teach his son a lesson? It was painful to realize that Elliot didn't even notice the lesson. And yet, Damien couldn't stop. He had to see it through. There had to be a turning point. There had to be a moment where Elliot would awaken to the truth of what he had lost. But that moment never came. One late afternoon, Damien found himself wandering through a part of the city he once frequented, a district filled with luxury hotels and upscale restaurants. The towering glass buildings seemed to mock him, but it was the familiar sight of an elite restaurant, the Laurentian, that caught his attention. He paused in front of the entrance, the memories flooding back. This had been one of his favorite spots to dine, a place where deals were made, where the elite gathered, where his influence had once been unquestioned. Through the large windows, he saw Elliot sitting at a table, surrounded by several well-dressed colleagues. He appeared to be in his element, charismatic, laughing easily, basking in the attention of those around him. Damien's heart clenched at the sight of his son, and a flood of emotion surged within him. He had hoped to find some sign that Elliot cared enough to search for him. But this lavish display of wealth, of privilege, was the final nail in the coffin. Damien could no longer stand idly by. His legs moved on their own, driven by a mixture of longing and despair. He pushed open the door to the restaurant, but the hostess immediately sized him up with a look of disdain. His appearance, unkempt and worn from weeks of living on the streets, was a stark contrast to the polished patrons of the establishment. "Sorry, sir," the hostess said with a tone that made it clear he was unwelcome. "This is a private establishment." Damien took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't going to be dismissed so easily. His voice cracked with emotion as he called out to Elliot. "Elliot," he said, the word catching in his throat. Elliot glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he processed the stranger standing before him. For a brief moment, Damien saw a flicker of recognition, a hint of confusion. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Who are you?" Elliot asked, his tone icy and dismissive. Damien's heart sank, but he forced himself to stay standing. "It's me, your father," he said quietly. The words felt foreign in his mouth, as though they had been stripped of their meaning. "I've been away," Elliot scoffed, a brief smile flickering on his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My father? I don't know you. You must be mistaken." His voice was cold, indifferent. He turned his attention back to his colleagues, signaling that the conversation was over. The hostess, sensing the awkwardness, stepped forward. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave, sir." Damien's chest tightened as he stood there, humiliated in front of his son and everyone else in the room. The man who had once commanded respect was now invisible, dismissed like an unwanted beggar. But it was Elliot's response, the total lack of recognition, the coldness, that cut deeper than anything else. Feeling the sting of rejection, Damien turned and walked out of the restaurant. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the city seemed to mock him as he disappeared into the streets once again. He had come here hoping for a sign, hoping that his son would show some glimmer of care. But instead, he had been reminded of just how far Elliot had fallen into the depths of his own selfish world. Damien's heart was broken, but it was also full of resolve. He had to act. Something had to change. Damien knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. The humiliation he had endured outside the Laurentian was a harsh reminder of how far Elliot had drifted from the values he once held dear. It had become painfully clear. His son wasn't just living in a world of privilege. He had embraced a toxic version of that privilege, one that bred arrogance, entitlement, and a complete disregard for the importance of family. Damien couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that Elliot's behavior was just a phase. It was no longer a matter of whether Elliot would change. It was a matter of whether Damien could find a way to help him understand the consequences of his choices. And so, with a heavy heart, Damien took the first step in what would be a drastic and painful decision. He contacted his lawyer, Samuel, a longtime trusted advisor who had worked with Damien on countless deals over the years. Samuel's voice was skeptical as he answered the phone, but Damien was resolute. "I need you to do something for me, Samuel. I want to reduce Elliot's inheritance," Damien said flatly. There was a long pause on the other end. "Damien, are you sure? That's a big step." "I'm sure," Damien replied. "I want to leave him with enough to survive, but no more. He needs to understand what it's like to work for everything he has. He needs to learn the hard way." Samuel hesitated again. "This is a big gamble, but if that's what you want, I'll handle it." Damien hung up the phone, his mind still spinning with the gravity of the decision. Taking away Elliot's inheritance would send a shockwave through their family. It would sever the last tie between them and everything that had defined their lives. But Damien was no longer concerned about the fallout. He was focused on one thing: helping Elliot find his way back to a life that valued integrity and hard work over wealth and indulgence. At the same time, Damien hired a private investigator, Clara, to dig into his son's activities. If he was going to take such a drastic step, he needed to understand just how far Elliot had fallen. Clara's report came back quickly, and it hit Damien like a sledgehammer. Elliot wasn't just living a life of excess. He had been involved in shady deals, betraying colleagues, manipulating clients, and cutting corners in every possible way to maintain his lavish lifestyle. His behavior was far worse than Damien had ever imagined. The boy he had raised had become a man driven by greed and a complete lack of moral compass. The betrayal stung more than anything else. Damien's decision, painful as it was, now seemed like the only way forward. Elliot had crossed a line, and now Damien would make sure that he felt the weight of his actions. It was time for the final confrontation. Damien had waited long enough, watched long enough. Elliot needed to face the truth of his choices, and Damien was determined to make him see the consequences. The family mansion stood in stark contrast to the life Damien had been living. It was grand and opulent, just as it had always been. But now, it felt empty, devoid of warmth. Damien had arranged for Elliot to come over for dinner. The first time in months they would share a meal together. Elliot walked in, his usual confident air slightly dampened by the strange silence in the house. His eyes flicked around the grandiose space, and Damien saw a flicker of unease, but it was gone in an instant. He had no idea what awaited him. At the dining table, Damien didn't mince words. "Elliot, I've watched you for years now. I've watched you squander everything I worked so hard to build. You've thrown away everything: integrity, loyalty, family. For what? For status? For power?" Elliot shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. Damien's gaze hardened. "You've betrayed every value I instilled in you," Damien continued, his voice growing colder. "I gave you everything: wealth, influence, the best education. But you've taken it all for granted. You've become someone I don't even recognize." Elliot finally spoke, his voice defensive, almost angry. "I built my own success. Don't tell me what I've done. You had everything handed to you." Damien leaned forward, his eyes locking with Elliot's. "Everything? You think I handed you success? You were given everything on a silver platter, Elliot. But now you've lost it all. You've squandered it all." He slid a stack of legal papers across the table, his hands steady. "This is the end of your inheritance, Elliot. You're cut off. I'm leaving you with nothing." Elliot's face contorted with rage as he looked at the documents, his hands trembling. "You can't do this!" he shouted. "You can't take everything from me!" "I already have," Damien said, his voice firm. "Now you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices." Elliot stormed out of the mansion, slamming the door behind him. Damien sat there, staring at the empty space where his son had been. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but this was the only way. The only way to make Elliot see the truth. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with a deep, painful silence. Damien sat in his study, staring at the legal documents that had severed his connection with his son's wealth. The mansion, once filled with the sounds of laughter and activity, now felt like an empty shell. He had done what he thought was necessary, but the weight of his actions gnawed at him. Would this really change Elliot? Would it break through his arrogance, or was it too late? Meanwhile, Elliot's life began to unravel in ways that Damien hadn't anticipated. At first, there was disbelief. Elliot could not fathom that his father, the man who had always supported him, would actually follow through with the severance. He tried calling Damien, leaving messages, demanding an explanation, but his father didn't pick up. The sense of entitlement that had defined Elliot for so long turned into desperation. His ventures, once buoyed by his inheritance, started to crumble. Without the financial backing he had relied on, his businesses began to falter. The clients who had once flocked to him, eager for his connections and influence, began to distance themselves. They had no interest in a man with nothing to offer but empty promises. One by one, his friends and associates turned their backs on him. The high-end lifestyle that Elliot had once taken for granted became a distant memory. As the days turned into weeks, Elliot was forced to confront the consequences of his arrogance and entitlement. Without the cushion of wealth to fall back on, he found himself in unfamiliar, humbling territory. No longer could he rely on others to solve his problems or prop up his failures. For the first time in his life, he was faced with his own limitations. It wasn't just his business ventures that were falling apart. His sense of self, his pride, and his identity were being stripped away piece by piece. In the midst of this collapse, Elliot's once luxurious apartment was sold off, his extravagant car repossessed. The plush furniture that had once defined his success was now replaced with the stark, empty walls of a man who had nowhere else to turn. Elliot had lost everything. His father's decision, harsh as it had been, had turned his world upside down. For the first time, he had no one to blame but himself. He could no longer hide behind his father's wealth or his own pride. One evening, after weeks of struggling to maintain some semblance of control, Elliot found himself standing outside the gates of the family mansion. The rain fell in steady sheets, soaking through his thin jacket, but he barely noticed. All he could think about was how far he had fallen. From the confident, powerful young man who had once believed the world was his for the taking, to this broken version of himself, alone and abandoned. His eyes wandered over the large estate, the sprawling gardens, and the towering mansion that had once been his home. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had sat at that dinner table, arguing with his father. Now, that table felt distant, a place he could never return to. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He had been wrong. All those years of thinking that wealth, power, and status were the things that defined success, he had been wrong. None of it mattered. The relationships he had burned, the people he had betrayed, the values he had abandoned, all of it seemed meaningless now. Elliot's chest tightened as he thought about his father. Damien had always been a man of integrity, a man who had worked tirelessly to build his fortune. He had given Elliot everything, only to see it squandered by a son who had been blinded by ambition and greed. Elliot had rejected his father's guidance, dismissing it as outdated or irrelevant. Now, as the rain soaked through his clothes, he realized that his father's love and wisdom had been the true source of his success all along. For the first time, he understood what Damien had been trying to teach him. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the deals or the fancy restaurants or the cars. It was about integrity. It was about family. It was about love. And Elliot had lost all of that in his quest for power. Standing there in the rain, his mind raced. Was it too late to fix things? Could he ever rebuild the trust he had shattered? Could he earn back his father's love and respect? These were the questions that haunted him as the rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of his former life. As Elliot walked away from the gates of the mansion, his clothes drenched and his heart heavy with regret, he felt something stirring deep within him. It was a quiet, determined resolve. For the first time in months, he knew what he had to do. He had to change. He had to rebuild his life. Not on the foundation of wealth or status, but on something deeper, something more lasting. He had to prove to himself, and perhaps to his father, that he could be a man of integrity, that he could earn his place in the world on his own merits. It wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty. But Elliot knew that he couldn't keep running from the mistakes of his past. He couldn't keep blaming others for his failures. He had to take responsibility, step by step, for the life he had created and the person he had become. As the rain began to lighten, Elliot wiped the water from his face and made a decision. He would start over. He would find a new path, one grounded in hard work, honesty, and humility. It would be a long journey, and he knew he couldn't undo the damage he had done overnight. But he was ready to try. For the first time in his life, Elliot wasn't focused on what he could get. He was focused on what he could give. He was ready to prove to himself, and maybe even to his father, that he was capable of more than he had shown before. As the story draws to a close, the lesson becomes clear. True wealth is not measured by material possessions, not by the cars we drive, the mansions we live in, or the titles we hold. True wealth lies in integrity, family, and love. Damien's drastic decision to sever Elliot from the family fortune was a painful one, but it was the only way to wake his son from the delusion that wealth could solve all his problems. It was the wake-up call that Elliot needed to understand that life is not about accumulating wealth or status. It's about living with honor and respecting the people around you. The story serves as a reminder to all who hear it that the things we value most, the relationships we build, the trust we earn, the love we give, are far more meaningful than anything money can buy. Elliot's journey, though filled with hardship and regret, ultimately leads him to the realization that success without integrity is hollow. And true success comes not from the riches we amass, but from the people we love and the values we live by. As the story ends, we are left to reflect on our own priorities. What is the true measure of success in our lives? What are we willing to sacrifice in order to live with integrity and love? These are the questions that linger, encouraging us to reassess our own paths and the legacy we want to leave behind. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. We truly appreciate your attention and hope that you found it meaningful and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed the journey with us, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with others who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot to us and helps us bring more content like this to you. Stay tuned for more exciting stories, and thank you again for being a part of this experience.